The Media Institute, the foremost independent advocate for the First Amendment for over 4 decades, is one of the nation's leading nonpartisan organizations focused on media and communications policy. The Media Institute promotes freedom of speech, recognizes excellence in journalism, and encourages a competitive media environment and communications industry. Considering the current state of affairs in the nation's capital and across the country, our mission is more relevant than ever. Thanks to our sponsors and supporters at the Platinum level: Beasley Media Group, Charter Communications, Consumer Technology Association, iHeartMedia, LG Electronics USA, Paramount, Tegna, and Verizon. Our gold sponsors include America's public television stations: CTIA, Everything Wireless, Comcast NBC Universal, the National Association of Broadcasters, and NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. Silver sponsors include ATSC, the Advanced Television Systems Committee, Altus USA, Cox Enterprises, Inc., DirecTV, DLA Piper, Fox Corporation, Lerman Center, PLLC, Microsoft, News Media Alliance, T-Mobile, U.S. Telecom, the Broadband Association, Wiley Rhine, LLP, and Wilkinson Barker Nauer, LLP. Thanks to all for making today's event possible. And now the President and CEO of the Media Institute, Rick Kapler.
Hey, good afternoon and welcome to our Communications Forum virtual luncheon for April. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start by telling you about a new First Amendment book by our distinguished fellow, Stuart Brotman. The University of Missouri Press has just released Stuart's latest book. It's titled The First Amendment Lives On: Conversations Commemorating Hugh M. Hefner's Legacy of Enduring Free Speech and Free Press Values. It's a collection of interviews that Stuart conducted with 8 First Amendment living legends, including 2 members of our own First Amendment Advisory Council, Floyd Abrams and Bob Corn Revere. It's a fascinating look at the First Amendment in modern times, as told in the words of the lawyers and scholars who have been on the front lines defending it. Again, it's called The First Amendment Lives On, and I hope you'll look for it on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. And just a word about next month's luncheon. On May 17th, we will welcome Federal Trade Commissioner Noah Phillips. There are quite a few issues at the Federal Trade Commission involving media companies and big tech, and I know Commissioner Phillips will have a lot to share with us. This will be a virtual event on Tuesday, May 17th. And then in June, we hope to have our first in-person event of the year. And we're still working out the details, but we'll keep you posted. And now let's get right to our program. A moment ago, I mentioned living legends, and I think it's fair to say we have a couple of them here with us today for a fireside chat. Michael Powell, President and CEO of NCTA, the Internet and Television Association, and Dick Wiley, the Media Institute's chairman of the board. Both Michael and Dick are former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, and I'd like to note that both have been recipients of the Media Institute's Freedom of Speech Award, Chairman Powell in 1999 and Chairman Wiley in 1992. Chairman Powell was appointed to the FCC by President Bill Clinton in 1997 and served as chairman under President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2005. During his time as FCC chairman, Michael oversaw the rapid transformation of communications markets into the digital age. During his tenure, the internet came into widespread commercial use, as did smartphones, Wi-Fi networks, and satellite radio. In his current role as head of NCTA, he leads one of the largest trade associations in Washington, representing the communications and content industries. His prior public service includes Chief of Staff of the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, Policy Advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and service as an armored cavalry officer in the U.S. Army. In the private sector, Michael practiced law and was a senior advisor in a private equity firm. Chairman Powell also served on the public boards of Cisco and AOL. Michael serves on several nonprofit boards as well. He is the chairman of the Mayo Clinic Board of Trustees, chairman of the William and Mary Foundation Board, and vice chairman of America's Promise Alliance. He received his bachelor's degree in government from William and Mary and his law degree from Georgetown University Law Center. He holds honorary doctorate degrees from William and Mary and Pepperdine University. We're eager to hear Michael's thoughts on the state of cable and broadband and where things might be headed. And I'm sure Dick has some good questions to get the discussion going. Let me remind our viewers that during our fireside chat, you'll have a chance to ask questions using the Ask a Question feature on your screen. Just type your questions and send them in, and Dick will have a good Q&A session with Michael after their chat. We're absolutely delighted to welcome Michael Powell here today. So let me turn the program over to Dick Wiley to get our discussion going.
Well, thank you, Rick. And Mr. Chairman, it's a pleasure to have you once again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to begin by discussing the cable industry health. How's it been doing during the COVID experience?
Yeah, I mean, number one, my heart is with everyone in this course of this pandemic. It's been really quite a stressful time. It certainly was for me and my family. But when I think about our industry in the midst of this really historic calamity, one of the first thoughts I had is, what if this had happened 20 years ago? What if this had happened before the rise of broadband? What if this had happened prior to the most recent surge of investment in which we really had footprints of gigabit networks throughout the country to handle work from home, work from school, and many other needs for the internet? If you think about it, it's probably the biggest network stress test one could have ever imagined or designed. And I think it fundamentally did pass with a high degree of reliability and effectiveness for our citizens. So much so that I think it allowed the government to depend on it as part of their early public health response. The idea of staying home or lockdowns or social distancing on some of the other measures that were essential for keeping people alive were only viable because of the network. And then I think what's really interesting too is not only did the pandemic not really damage the industry, from my perspective, it dramatically accelerated progress. Gigabit networks are now really the norm in our industry. We're moving expeditiously toward 10G. During this period, I think the average download speeds probably increased over 54% since before the pandemic. At the same time, prices are low while we're wringing our hands about inflation. Broadband prices are really increasing only 2.3% when inflation's rising at 8.5%. So we're pretty happy with our performance. But lastly, I would say it also demonstrated how critical the infrastructure is to all Americans. And I think it fortifies the need to close the digital gap as expeditiously and effectively as possible.
Let's move in a little bit and focus more on the broadband infrastructure, if you will. As we see the transition now from the congressional funding stage to program and design and execution phase, so to speak, how do you think things are going?
Well, we're really just getting started, but I think I'd make a couple of observations. It's an astounding amount of money going to a lot of places through a lot of different agency programs. This initiative really represented a sea change shift from how we normally administer these kinds of programs. Like I said, it's an awesome and unprecedented amount of money that's directly going to subsidize building in unserved areas. Secondly, it's really interesting because it's really a shift from programs that are primarily administered at the federal level to a system where grants are going to be provided to 50 different states and 50 different administrations and distribution mechanisms. We also see a shift where the federal oversight really is at the Department of Commerce and NTIA, not at the FCC, where we have a lot of expertise and experience. So that will be new challenges both for commerce and for the industry. And it's a brand new program. It's not utilizing the traditional mechanisms of universal service that we all are accustomed to. So I think in short, what that does is it creates, if we're sober about it, a high degree of implementation risk we're all going to have to really be focused on. I'll just take a second to name what I think those are. I think, first of all, I think we've learned from history the danger, the historical and classic error that's made in these programs is we are not rigorous enough in ensuring the money goes to the unserved areas that truly need it the most. These are the areas that almost by definition are uneconomical. If you are not disciplined, the money will find its way to more profitable markets, and it'll lead to redundancy and overbuilding, and it will consequently sap money away from the areas that most need it most, and we'll wake up and wonder why we still have huge parts of the country that are unserved. This can happen in two ways. States administering the program can explicitly allow it, or we could just have really poor coordination across all the various subsidy programs that exist. For example, you have a lot of money out there under the RDOF program. You wouldn't want to treat that area as unserved from the new BEAD program. The other thing is there's a danger that you invest in really inexperienced network builders. A lot of companies form just to get a shot at this money. We see a lot of private equity and venture firms, quick buck investors trying to get in on this market, figure out how to make money quickly. That often can distort and destroy the incentives of the program. And the last two things, I think, is the danger of just going off topic. We need to stay laser focused on the objective. This isn't a time to kind of introduce other broadband policies or other experiments that will detract us from the principal focus, and also create disincentives for carriers to participate. And then lastly, any program of this size, if not overseen carefully with a high degree of transparency, will lead to waste, fraud, and abuse. It's almost inevitable. And I think we need to ensure that both the government and its private partners aren't embarrassed 4 years from now to discover that half the money went out the back door or half the money was wasted on builders and programs that didn't know what they were doing and ultimately wasted this once in a century opportunity. So I think it's exciting. And fortunately, it's also coupled with really compelling efforts to help low-income families and communities better afford broadband through new direct subsidy broadband programs that we're excited about. We've long been a leader in trying to help low-income communities get online, and we're happy to see the government partner with the industry on that program.
Mr. Chairman, you really started this whole thing called net neutrality, albeit as principles, and to your credit, I think, and it was really under Title I. During the Obama years, we, of course, moved to Title II, and we're back at Title I now. Do you foresee that in the Rosenworcel FCC, we might move once again to Title II? And if so, what would be your reaction to that?
Well, I got to admit, my first reaction is to sigh, because I think this has to be about the sixth turn of the net neutrality merry-go-round. And I'm probably speaking for more people than myself who say we're sort of exhausted by it, bored by it, tired of it, somewhat sick of the ride. And to be honest, I think with good reason. I think net neutrality lives on after 2 decades more as a product of a culture of misinformation and distorted storytelling that's very light on facts and very heavy on emotion and fear. We frequently heard during the pandemic the mantra that we should be following the science. Well, that's a good mantra here too. Science depends on the scientific method. And, there was an asserted hypothesis 2 decades ago that ISPs had an incentive and an ability to engage in this kind of blocking or content interference effort. And there were very few facts or evidence available to substantiate that hypothesis, but we nonetheless proceeded on a path to regulate against it. But we now have 2 decades of experience, and no such pattern in practice has ever emerged in the marketplace. And in fact, the PI rules, which repealed the latest set of net neutrality rules, are almost 5 years old. And there's been no pattern of harm observed. If anything, capacity and network investment has expanded dramatically. From 2017 to 2020, I think the percentage of cable's footprint with a gig surface has gone to 800%, from 10% to 84% in the same amount of time. Look, I think it's important to just say some truths about this. Net neutrality was a bit of a Trojan horse that I think was rolled into Washington a lot by the big tech community, who feared obstacles in their kind of continuing march to dominance. And at the time, I think a lot of policymakers, let's be frank, worshiped this crowd and fully invested in their vision. They believed them, they trusted them. I think the commission and the Obama administration believed these companies and their services were infinitely good and virtuous. And we're finding out that's not true. We're finding out that there's very substantial harm as a consequence of their growing dominance. I watched with interest last week as President Obama gave a very compelling speech about misinformation. I wish during their tenure they were equally as concerned with their growing strength, because they weren't. And I think we've seen today that the real gatekeepers in the internet ecosystem are these tech armies that fundamentally got inside the walls. And I personally think it's kind of arbitrary and capricious to see the commission regulate to protect an open internet when the people who have the unparalleled amount of control over how open it is are really tech companies not subject to the rules. We see Elon Musk buying Twitter on the assumption that there's too much blocking going on in the expression of free speech. So I just don't know how a country can attest to being concerned about those objectives, but approach it by only regulating a small part of the industry ecosystem that has no demonstrated a pattern of engaging in that content. And then let me just wipe this up, because this is a special issue for me. A couple other points that I think are worth making. It's a massive distraction. It's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take a lot of resources. A lot of controversy is going to be spilled on net neutrality. And whatever the consequences of the rulemaking, it's not going to make a whit of difference in the marketplace, but it's going to be a massive distraction from the two critical internet priorities of our day. This unprecedented historical opportunity to build infrastructure and get it right. This is what we need to be focused on. And the important work of curtailing excessive power in the hands of big tech companies, which is the focus of Congress today. And again, by the way, even those companies recognize the importance of creating some kind of predictable regulatory environment for them to operate in some predictable, sane way. And these are rules that, let's be honest, they're going to be dead before they're born, meaning they kind of are born with a fatal disease that really weakens their viability. And that disease is that they're super easy to change and there's no political consensus around them. So the result will be, no matter what the rules are, they're going to die the very next time a Republican government comes to power.
Well, given all that, Mr. Chairman, what do you think the possibilities are for some definitive type of congressional legislation that might halt the ping-ponging from a regulatory standpoint we've seen back and forth, one to Title I to Title II and vice versa?
In all my heart, I wish the people's representatives would take on this issue and mint a compromise that was stable and enduring, because I think there's sufficient consensus to do so. I don't typically believe in prediction, but I don't think there's a high probability of that happening anytime soon in the current partisan political environment, and an election on the horizon. We seem to always have an election on the horizon. I think Democrats are probably content to let the FCC do all the heavy carrying on this. So yeah, we continue to be supportive of that, but I don't think it's a very high probability. But the ways to make this final are, Congress acts, the FCC acts as an honest broker and tries to find a compromise that would create an enduring, stable set of rules, which I hope the chairwoman will pursue, or the courts. We've had a lot of changes in the courts. Net neutrality has never really gotten its fair airing in the Supreme Court of the United States. I suspect this time around it might. And, the courts might ultimately make some changes to the flexibility to flip these rules back and forth, but we'll see. But it's fatiguing and I think distracting from the real work of the day.
Mr. Chairman, let's talk about paid television. As you certainly know, in recent years, we've seen a lot of cord cutting, the proliferation of streaming services, and the availability of increasingly sophisticated viewing devices. So what do you see as the future of paid television and the eponymous programming bundle?
Look, I think Americans have an insatiable appetite for outstanding content. I think in many ways we've been in the golden age of content innovation and creation, and I think content producers are really finding all these venues for distribution empowering from a creativity standpoint. I think the pay TV market remains a really vibrant marketplace, whether you're talking about classic pay TV, meaning cable and satellite MVPD, or streaming. They're all pay TV formats. I think streaming has been a pretty exciting development. For all my career, I've heard a lot of debate, more times than I can count, over a la carte and giving consumers more atomistic choices. Well, in many ways, we've had that, or we've had greater experiments in that than we've ever had before. Me, my family, and friends are drowning in individualized show choices across lots and lots of platforms. So, look, it's pretty vibrant. The market's really steaming along with this. But I think there's some trends, Dick, that really interest me that I think will affect that future. We've seen it recently in Netflix's Q1 earnings that, clearly we've hit some turbulent waters in the streaming juggernaut. And I think you can see some kind of tax in that market, tax back to some of the things that recommended the cable model. I think bundles are sort of creeping back. A lot of content can only be found exclusively on one platform or another. That's a form of bundling. If shows are only available on HBO Max or Peacock, then that's essentially a bundled chiclet of content of a sort. I think content curation is becoming even more important in a sea drowning in content. If you think about the Discovery Warner Brothers Warner merger, and then supposedly plans to put those platforms together, that's just so much content that you have to curate an effective interface for people to find stuff. I've noticed a lot more streaming shows, rather than being dropped as full binge products, are now being released in weekly episodes, kind of like good old fashioned I Love Lucy. Stay tuned till next week, in order to try to keep customers more sticky. Advertising tiers are working their way back in. And I think they have a problem with helping consumers find their shows. I don't know about at your house, but in my house, it's always, oh, this is a great show. What platform is on? Where do you find it? How do you get it? Do I have that? Do I have that subscription? That will continue to be an issue that I think innovation in the industry will have to tackle in some form of aggregation. Lastly, just the finances. I think these companies are really working their way with, we threw the puzzle pieces in the air about how the revenue is earned and in what format. And I think that'll get restructured. So look, if you look at viewing, it's split across the industry. Cable still has about 37% of viewing, streaming about 29%, broadcast television probably around 25%. So, consumers have a lot of platform choice and content choice. So I think it's good for them. The innovation's good for the country. And I think it's an area that doesn't need much government assistance, contrary to days of old. So I think the future is bright, but it won't be linear.
So what do you think all these trends that you've delineated mean for the regulatory environment that the cable industry and other traditional MVPDs face?
Yeah, it's the problem that gets a teeny bit worse every day that goes by in the modern era. We still are sitting on a organic statute that's decades old now, that really is written with very different technical and economic predicates that are no longer valid. So you reference cable and Title VI, you don't have to look very hard to understand that the market is radically different than the premises on which Title VI was built. When Title VI passed, cable was really the only MVPD multi-channel provider in the country, in the game. I would be first to admit that it had near dominant quasi-monopolistic power over that market. There was a high degree of vertical integration back then with content, a lot of channels integrated with their cable systems. There's radically less of that today than there was then, but yet we still have cable rules, program access, program carriage kinds of rules that are premised on the assumption of that vertical power. And I also think, Dick, in your wheelhouse, the country had a much deeper investment in broadcast television, I'll put it that way, that the over-the-air market was substantially larger. It has shrunk substantially. It's not by any means dead, but it is not the dominant source of news, information, and entertainment that it was at the time. That was a source of concern for policymakers in a way that is a little less so today. So look, the top video subscription services in the United States right now are all OTT providers. Netflix has 70 million domestic subs, is number one. The top cable provider in the country, Comcast, is only number 7 at about 18 million subs. And yet these rules sort of presuppose the opposite. So number one, I'd commend the FCC. They've been willing to listen as we've asked them to look at and try to reform and modernize some of their rules. We hope they continue to do that, like they have with the recent modifications in 621. That was recently upheld by the Sixth Circuit. So look, one of the challenges we all have in the bar and in our world is how do we keep evolving the 96 Act to be relevant or to be put to bed where it's merited?
Just as an extension of that area, as you know, the commission's had this long dormant proceeding on how over-the-top internet streaming services and other virtual MVPDs should be treated, and whether it should be the same as cable and other traditional program developers. How do you feel about that?
My personal view, which I hold with some conviction, is I just don't think the statute allows for it. I think it's a contorted interpretation of the statute to suggest that the commission has the authority to classify video providers who are not facilities-based as MVPDs. To my mind, the statute's quite clear about that. The historical context is quite clear about that. And I really worry that for the FCC to pursue that or to actually adopt that perspective is a kind of overreaching power grab, breathtaking expansion of their authority that I think just really can't be fairly built on the plain language of the statute. Now, Chairman Wheeler, proposed this and, tried to interpret these provisions as ambiguous, but, waving your ambiguity wand over language doesn't make it so. And, I think that interpretation led to really distorted results that couldn't be reconciled. And I think NCTA, we filed as such in 2015, making that argument. So that's my view about it. We'll see. We haven't heard a lot about this proceeding. I know some broadcasters would love to see this picked up again. But look, I just never like spending a lot of time on regulatory sophistry that I think at the end of the day just can't pass judicial muster. I just think it's poor use of the commission's time and resources. That's what I thought when I was chairman. I still think that as a citizen and steward.
You talked about big tech earlier, and we've seen a lot of talk recently about privacy and consumer protection. How does the cable industry feel about all these issues?
Well, all these issues in big tech, that's a big question. I think where I would start is to say, number one, we just have to take cognizance of their significance. Now, that sounds obvious, but if you were to survey the regulatory landscape, you would almost think they don't exist. Meaning the classic bucket of communication styled and electronic communication digital market regulation really does hardly speak to their presence or their existence. Yet, I think these are amazing companies. My own view is they probably are the most powerful companies in the history of America or the history of the world. Their size is breathtaking. They're nation state sized, literally. Their reach is deep and expansive. Their wealth is eye-dropping, right? When Elon Musk can single-handedly buy a company using $26 billion of his own money to privately own what is supposedly a public square, I don't know how you can't take cognizance of the fact that we Americans are being very directly and dramatically affected by these industries, by these companies, and by their acquisitive power. They do have a kind of OPEC-like control over a lot of data that shapes our lives. And I think they're fine people. I think they're fine examples of industrial success. But I just don't think you can ignore them in the context of policymaking. It's like when you go back to your point about net neutrality, how can you have any intellectually honest conversation about blocking content or throttling content or discriminating in content when you're not even going to have a conversation about the ways that happens in their part of the ecosystem, and yet we probably will. That's just incongruous and I think out of balance. Now, I think I've always believed that the first body of law that would attempt or get close to this was antitrust. And I think you see the most energy in Congress around that topic. I think the antitrust bar is exploring the extension of their doctrines to try to make more sense in the modern era. You see the Europeans have recently passed quite expansive digital regulatory regime that's going to affect these companies and affect the global markets that they operate in. So look, I think, we're not hateful of them. We're even partially admiring of them, but we're sometimes fearful of them. And we sometimes think the government makes really bad policy choices because it doesn't fully incorporate their presence or an understanding that they really are the controller of outcomes that we profess are in the public interest.
But you don't really see any likelihood of congressional action to somehow restrict social media, do you?
I do someday, I actually do. I think, look, there's government in the short term and government in the long term. We have a slightly, sometimes dysfunctional, highly partisan legislating making apparatus, but things are impossible right up to the moment that they're not. Dick, I don't think you could have ever convinced me you'd get a $65 billion appropriation to support closing the digital divide on rural unserved areas in America. Probably 3 years before the pandemic, I would have said, you're dreaming. But yet the pandemic came along, created and galvanized a force for a commitment to that, and the political process responded. Look, social media platforms are affecting the lives of children and adults and Ukrainians and democracy and autocracy and public health and every other existing facet of the human condition. The idea that we're not on borrowed time before the right series of catastrophes takes place that will propel a democratic administration or legislature into direct action, I think that moment's probably inevitable, even if it isn't progressing at the pace that it probably should. If the 2016 election wasn't enough of a wake-up call, and the Russians and the invasion of Ukraine is not a big enough of a wake-up call, I would encourage you to read Jonathan Haidt's piece in The Atlantic this week about how did America get uniquely stupid over the last 10 years, a breathtaking examination of the country's technological evolution and how it's negatively impacted society. Ultimately, the government is the steward of the people's interest, and I think I'm not sure the people will tolerate some of the consequences forever. And at some point, I think the system will be forced to respond.
Mr. Chairman, we've got a couple of questions from
Okay.
audience, and I'm going to hit you with it. This is one says the broadcasters are cavorting, use that term, in Las Vegas, touting their dreams for next-gen TV, ATSC 3.0. So far, there's been zero market demand, this person says, for any of this. Obviously, 3.0 poses several options for broadband, from video transmission to data delivery competition. Can you say anything about it?
Well, I can tell where the questioner's sympathies lie. Too bad I'm not cavorting in Las Vegas to have that conversation. Look, I take a big picture view of this, Dick. I think it's the same set of issues we've seen many times going back to the HDTV transition or anytime there's an evolution. I've watched in my career many times broadcasters, as well as other industries, get excited about a new opportunity and a new technology and want to start moving the industry in that direction. I personally, and I don't think the cable industry has any real objection to them moving businesses and innovated in that direction. But look, this stuff also often comes with the potential risk or consequences that one industry's objective or vision imposes costs or burdens on other industries or consumers. And when that is obviously the case, which it could be in the case of next gen and ATSC 3.0, then I think you have to be careful and work through the right public balance of who's bearing those costs, whether in the form of other industries or consumers. You'll remember, and you're the great father of HDTV, you'll remember this was a big problem in the HDTV transition, ultimately required the government provide direct converter box subsidies in order to clear the market of that cost impediment on the cable industry and on consumers. It really wasn't until that happened we really could get over the line. So we always have to be careful here. I don't know what the consumer demand will or won't be for the service. That's what markets are for. But I think it will become a more challenging issue the greater cost it imposes on others and how those costs are going to be resolved by public policy, if at all.
Let me follow up on that question, saying that recently broadcasters and cable have been, shall we say, at odds about proposals to loosen the multicast rules for next-gen television. Can you fill us in on NCTA's concerns?
Yeah, NCTA, look, as the cable industry, we are always trying to be careful to protect our interests when another industry is evolving their industry in a way that we think could have negative implications for consumers, our viewers, and our industry. The regulatory tool of similarity, and in your existing transmission is not a new issue. It is a tried or true public policy in an effort to ensure that customers are not disadvantaged in the course of the transition. I think we supported wholeheartedly the introduction of that condition that the commission adopted in the first instance. I think if my recollection's correct, it also contained a sunset, I believe, in 2023 for the commission to have the opportunity to freely and effectively re-examine that. I'm a fan of those kinds of sunsets so that you don't get stuck indefinitely. I understand the broadcaster argument, but whether market conditions or the kinds of conditions that motivated the commission to impose the requirement in the first place have dissipated, I'm not sure. I have some doubt, but I'm not sure. But I think that'll be a question for the commission when we get closer to the approach of the sunset.
Well, on the question of whether broadcasters would somehow loosen the quality of their programming, don't you think the marketplace would take care of that?
Yeah, I'm not the lobbyist for the broadcasters. They'll make that argument for you, Dick. Maybe. Fortunately, not something I have to study on a daily basis at the NCTA desk.
Okay. Now, here's a question that's a little different. Have you ruled out running for political office, Mr. Chairman? And what office might attract some interest on your part?
You're too kind or you're cruel. I don't know which the two I would have to assign to you on that question.
That came from the audience.
I would say two things, and you're going to misinterpret this, but my wonderful great late father used to say to me, never say never and never say always. There's no such thing. I very much believe in that, but I could get as close as possible in saying that about the idea of any interest in me running for office. Thank you for your interest in that, but I have lots of loves and interests that are satisfied elsewhere, and I admire those who have the courage, the time, the interest to pursue public service in that way. I've chosen not to. So
here's another question. It says, as a fellow William and Mary and Georgetown law alum, that's your background.
Okay, that narrows the crowd down.
I'm interested in your thoughts about what you'd like college students to understand about speech regulation, government censorship versus private actor editing versus full wild west of no oversight whatsoever.
Look, this is a very, very I'm very involved on the campus of William and Mary. These are very, very painful, difficult issues among our kids in college, particularly. Look, I fall back on an understanding often very eloquently articulated by the Supreme Court of the United States in many instances in which it weighs these questions. First, you have to understand that it's a fundamental premise of a vibrant democracy of multiculturalism and diverse perspectives that you have to allow a high degree of conflicting and even at times painful and hurtful speech as a price for a system that has to resolve very contentious and competing values, all which have some degree of legitimacy, even when sometimes aspects of them don't. So I am much more pro in understanding that a marketplace of speech and ideas is very, very important. At the same time, I have a particular understanding of how brutal and painful speech can be. I've seen it in the context of racism be vicious, destroy the self-confidence, the worth of an individual through word. And it's not so much the word, it's the weaponizing of the word in a continuous, predictable, and combative way. This is a kind of turbo fuel that social networking has provided. So if you're a professor on a college campus speaking to 300 students, it used to be that you could take certain kinds of risks with material and literature. Most of those students would understand, appreciate it. One student might be upset by it, but that wouldn't necessarily threaten your career but now, you're in danger of every time you speak, you're speaking to the globe because people are streaming it, texting it, posting it. You're not allowed the intimacy on a college campus in the way that you would hope for sometimes in exploring what are difficult and painful ideas that often touch on values and democracy and emotion and meaning. That those are difficult conversations to have. But if you have to have those conversations in front of the world with an outrage industrial complex ready to pass judgment on it, I think something's lost. And I think our students should be taught that to be a person of intellect, to be a person of wisdom, is a person who has to be able to also navigate and hold difficult and contradicting ideas in their minds and within their emotion sets.
Mr. Chairman, here's a final question.
Sure.
From the audience. NTIA is aiming for a 100 /20 megabits per second is a standard for broadband. What should the broadband benchmark be in your view?
Well, look, there's a objective answer to that question. Is it at the moment it is what the FCC says it is, which is 25.3. So
Right.
that's not meant to be flipped, but when we're going to build predictable regulatory processes on definitions, it gets very convoluted to have myriad definitions floating around the country that don't provide clarity and certainty. If you have the principal regulatory agency of the country utilizing one set of benchmarks to define broadband that then doesn't constitute the number somewhere else, that's just a lot of chaotic uncertainty. You do need an authority. You do need some sort of finality in that definition. My second answer is, and we could argue about, is it 25.3 or is it something else? I don't want to get into the relative nature of speeds. But look, if your goal is to go after the neediest, which I am passionately committed that that's the goal, then you should define that goal as the people who've got the rawest deal, the people who have the least access to the infrastructure, the weakest speeds. If you start using speeds that define the broadband middle class, or start using speeds that define the broadband upper middle class, then what you're really doing is just moving away from targeting and helping the neediest and throwing into the basket of supplicants who are going to feed on this money to include a lot of people who already have satisfied that public policy objective. They have access at affordable rates. They're buying the service. Now you're straying into something that's more about regulating technical standards or pricing, and you're losing the mission of the unserved. So I think 25.3 as a benchmark for unserved at the moment is compelling because the FCC uses it. And secondly, because we should be trying to define the target set to the people who need it most.
Mr. Chairman, it's always a pleasure to hear your views. Thank you so much again for being with us. Let me turn the program over to Rick, our CEO.
Yeah, thank you, Dick. Thank you, Chairman Powell. What a terrific presentation today. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on such a wide range of issues and giving us such insightful perspectives on these many topics. We're great to have you here. Glad you could be back with us today. It's been a few years, and we hope it won't be that long again next time. But we're thrilled to have you here with us today, and we thank you very much for sharing your perspectives with us. And Chairman Wiley, thank you for a wonderful job of leading our fireside chat here and bringing so much good material to the table. And it was just a wonderful time to talk through a lot of these issues. So, gentlemen, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
I want to thank our outstanding luncheon sponsors for making this series possible. And a special thanks to Dave Arland and his team at Arland Communications for producing today's event. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you again, gentlemen. And we'll see you back here on May 17th for Commissioner Noah Phillips. Thanks and have a great afternoon.
Thank you to our guest speaker today. Thank you to the Navy Band, and a big thank you again to our sponsors. We'll see you next month.